Miss Finlay was neither liked nor disliked by the girls, for she never took part in their feuds, never made spiteful remarks, and always remained politely aloof when they chatted scandal. When it was her turn to make tea, she made the tea rather well. When one of the girls wished to leave the office early, she would always take over undone work without complaint. Her voice, whilst not being remarkable either for its beauty or its ugliness, was somewhat girls' public school and therefore excellent material for the office mimics. She arrived every morning on the dot of 9:30, summer and winter, fair weather or foul, and except when the roads were slippery with snow or ice, she invariably travelled on a green sports bicycle with drop handlebars. This she kept in top-notch condition, parking it during the day in the tiled corridor on the ground floor for all to see and admire. Whence she came no one knew, nor whither she returned. An excerpt there from the earlier sections of Peter Marchant's Give Me Your Answer, Do, a novel originally published in 1960 and republished very recently in 2022 by Tough Poets Press. If you look up Give Me Your Answer, Do, you will find about 3 results that aren't booksellers. One will be Tough Poet Press's website, the other will be the original Kickstarter page for this new edition, and the other will be a site called Neglected Books. To say this is an overlooked and neglected novel is a drastic understatement. In fact, on the Kickstarter page, it's made clear by Shoba, the publisher from Tough Poets Press, that there probably was about 1 review in 1960, and that was quite difficult to find. And it's not all that long of a review, which is a shame, because this is a beautiful, heartfelt, measured, warm novel. Ultimately, and I'm taking this line from that one review because it's so helpful, ultimately about the collision of fantasy and reality. It's inventive whilst being measured. It's warm whilst not being cheap. Much of the time it is quintessentially British without being kitsch. And it is mythological in a sense in all the right ways, with little tinges of almost Blakean imagination, joy, and a certain love for childhood and childhood imagination that doesn't ally itself with either side via the writing. It allows the reader to make up their mind as to what we are to make of the ending, which I'll get to, so there is spoilers in some sense. Now, the plot appears on the surface as strange, but it's written in a fairly, dare I say it, straightforward, measured, rhythmic prose that carries you along at a brisk pace without seeming rather coy. The plot is about Margaret Finlay, who is a woman who is now 31. We meet her at 31. She's working in some office, and she's really that trope of the overlooked woman in the office who is quiet, doesn't do anything at the weekends, as per that excerpt, always makes the tea, rides a bike, very meek, keeps to herself, and just doesn't engage in any of, not just that office politics, but doesn't engage in anything alike that in the world. She is meek like a church mouse and sort of tucked away. And these early sections that overview Margaret in this sense give us, before we even know about it, give us a feeling, an impression that the world has, not physically, but mentally, psychologically, and emotionally brutalized her. She's been beaten down in a very quintessentially boarding school manner, as per the UK of a certain era. You know, we already get the sense, before this is ultimately confirmed time and time again, that there has been, you know, a matriarch figure in her life telling, you know, don't do this, do that, don't do this, you know, tuck your shirt in. This kind of very classical British authoritarian finger wagging, stay in your line, you know, children shouldn't look up. And Finlay has taken this on to the nth degree. She has become sort of a vessel that just carries this suffocating attitude and atmosphere of the sort of British boarding school, public school life of the era of caning, and children should be seen and not heard. And what the cathartic release valve, pressure release of this for us and Margaret, if this doesn't exist, it would be just pure tragedy, is that during a case of the measles, sort of at a symbolic moment of complete depression, not just emotionally but generally, the whimsical child that is Margaret has been quite literally, bedladen, sickly, still with a matriarchal figure trying to tell her what to do while she's in bed, and completely compressed. And yet this childish, in a positive sense, not like childish as in silly, but childish in that Blakean sense, this childish, whimsical, imaginative energy, we still feel that bouncing around in young Margaret. And so who appears but an imaginary friend, so called Bradshaw, that is a horse. And so I'll just give you an example of the sort of being beaten down, and then I will introduce you to Bradshaw. So in terms of this British attitude, from 9 till 12:30 every morning, arithmetic, geography, grammar, and French, with Miss Pritchard rapping on the table that she was a naughty, stupid little girl who would never learn anything if she didn't concentrate instead of dreaming. In the afternoon, a walk to the village with Miss Pritchard saying, "Don't, Margaret," all the time, and pointing out flowers or trees or animals that Margaret had already noticed, and making a lesson of them. Tea at 5 o'clock in the nursery, then 3/4 of an hour's preparation for her lessons in the morning, and 1/4 of an hour's free time to play with her toys. Then bath, bed, and a mug of hot milk with skin wrinkling the top, which Miss Pritchard said was the best part, and insisted on stirring into the rest. Margaret could never decide which she hated more, the scummy hot milk or Miss Pritchard. "Good night, Margaret. Sleep well." "Good night, Miss Pritchard. Please may I have the door a bit open so that I can see the landing light?" "Certainly not. I never heard of such nonsense. Go to sleep this instant, and don't fuss." "Why doesn't Daddy say good night to me any more?" "Because he's too busy, I expect. Now stop fussing and go to sleep." "Margaret, you are not to be in the kitchen. Now run along and play in the fresh air." "Margaret, you are not to play in your mother's rose garden. You know that as well as I do." "Margaret, if I catch you clambering over the rockery any more, I shall have to report you to your mother. I've told you time and time again, and I'm getting tired of telling you." "Margaret, don't answer them back. They're the village children, and I've told you you're not to speak to them." "Why mayn't I speak to them? Are they naughty?" "No, they're not exactly naughty. Then why mayn't I speak to them?" Because they're rough." "How are they rough, Miss Pritchard? Do they play with knives and throw stones and spit?" "No, I don't think so." "Are they dirty?" "I don't really know, Margaret. Do stop pestering me with questions." "But why mayn't I?" "Because I say so, and because your mother says so. Let that be sufficient." And this attitude is everywhere in Margaret's childhood. And it's written beautifully by Marchant, Peter Marchant, the author, in the sense of a subtle defense of, again, Blakean childhood love of life. These little subtle hints of Margaret already seeing, already noticing the flowers and the trees. These little, not talking back, but that cunning that children have, and the great love and joy of the fresh air, but then being taken away from that immediately, in this contradictory, hypocritical attitude of the adults. But it's not done to such a degree that we are sort of factionalized either way. But however, we are the opening, this first sort of 40 pages, are this continual crushing. We begin with the crushed young woman as an adult now, Margaret Finlay in her office, understanding that she's been crushed by the weight of this sort of light bureaucratic children shall be seen and not heard authoritarianism. Then we're given the sort of progression of how that happened, and piled and piled and piled on to the point where we need, as the reader, we need a not a savior. We just need something. We need some carrier for this joy. And it's in this point, again, when Margaret has measles, so almost like the lowest point, you're being told what to do when you're sickly in the most awful, repressive way, that we are introduced to Bradshaw. The door closed and Margaret was alone, except for M, of course. Nothing for hours. And then only Miss Pritchard with tea, and after tea, a jigsaw puzzle. She loathed jigsaw puzzles. She always lost the pieces in the bed, pieces of jigsaw and breadcrumbs. She had prayed for a change, but this was much worse. There was no one to talk to except M, of course, but now M was imprisoned in Margaret's measly body. Oh, for a real friend. Ride a cock horse to Banbury Cross to see a fine lady upon a white horse. No, a pony trotted up to the bedside. He loved Margaret, though he didn't usually like little girls. Margaret was different because she was very clever and interesting, and was two people, Margaret and M. Margaret was ugly with braces, squint eyes, and flat hair that just would not curl, and M was as fair as a lily, invisible to everyone except Bradshaw. He was called Bradshaw, like the railway timetable in the hall. Bradshaw was a lovely name. It meant a train to London, a boat to India, or Peter Pan wings to the moon. To places where there was no mummy, no Miss Pritchard, and no smell of measles, where instead there was a smell of lavender, and children, hand in hand with their daddies, ran down sunflower yellow beaches to a sea as blue as forget-me-not sparkling in the sunlight, and waves cold as ice cream frothed along the sands. Bradshaw, beautiful Bradshaw! Margaret stretched for the tin of talcum powder on the pedestal cupboard and smelt it deep down. It was Bradshaw's breath. And so we're introduced to the two other characters really that are here. So M, which is this sort of imagined version of Margaret within herself, who is understood to be able to sort of fly around, not literally, but in that imaginative sense. And of course, we're also introduced to Bradshaw, who is her imaginary friend, at times companion, and in a certain way becomes this very complicated in the sense of whether or not it's good or bad, what in psychoanalytical language would be understood as a transitional object, where this is from Winnicott, where some children would have teddy bears that they hold on to. Winnicott would understand that what the teddy bear represents as a transitional object is during that stage of a child's life where they move from being able to legitimately have this one-to-one, quite literally holding on to their parents' relationship, to having to be fully independent as a human being on their own away from their parents. This transitional object is that object that is the companion of safety. A blankie is actually another example. And what's interesting about the transitional object in theory is that it can actually appear time and again. It can sort of beckon its head at later stages in life as that island of safety. So Bradshaw enters not only as this brilliant imaginative sort of vision in a way of the actual imagery of Bradshaw as this pony who speaks a language that only Margaret can understand and has a breath that smells like talcum powder, but is now our companion amidst this world, which one feels that without Bradshaw and without this imaginative pressure release, that one would just surely die in some sort of lay down and just fall asleep. Now, before I go on and do the second part of the plot, I do want to sort of introduce the author. So we'll get back to that. So we've got to the point where Bradshaw has entered. Because the book has been forgotten, and Peter Marchant, of course, has also been forgotten, who had a fascinating life. So I'll give a brief overview of him. He was born in 1928 during the war, sent to a boarding school himself, 1 year studying economics, lots of acting, lots of writing, 2 short plays, fails his exams, joins the army, assigned to the Educational Corps, where he finds his lifelong love of teaching. And then following his military service, he ends up working various little jobs, one with his father, before entering the University of Cambridge, and he studies history and English. And then he moves to Canada, enrolls in a PhD, meets his wife, and after Give Me Your Answer Do is his thesis novel published with sort of alongside after his PhD, and he begins teaching a specialty in 19th century British novel. It seems that the rest of his life is largely to do with teaching, and then he's active in the peace movement during the Vietnam War, joins the Religious Society of Friends in the 70s, becomes a Quaker, and he is one of the early teachers and popularizers, in a certain sense, of the literature of the Holocaust and the education of the Holocaust, helping many of them write their own memoirs. And then he passes away in 2013. So he has a life of education and writing that has a focus toward a certain form of it, I think, inner emancipation, freedom, and peace from authority. There isn't too much about him elsewhere at all, so I'm sort of just taking that from this very minor amount of detail that we have. But given the setting of Give Me Your Answer Do, the focus here is on the question, and the focus is, yes, we have this authoritarian, stifling atmosphere that's almost militaristic, boarding school militaristic, with a reliance on perhaps dated etiquette and heavy etiquette and all these rules that seem to stifle a true love for flowers and joys and frivolity. But equally, the question arises, so this early sections where we're initially introduced to Bradshaw, we see him really and understand him as nothing but refreshing, as nothing but what we need, because Bradshaw at this point is only within the mind of a child. But what happens is, and this is to continue on with the plot here, what happens is Bradshaw, in that role as that sort of transitional object, as I said, Finlay, Margaret, our protagonist, in the present day, sort of doesn't snap in the sense of a mental breakdown, but lightly snaps in the sense that she feels pressured by them to finally say something about herself, to finally define herself in some way. And so what does she do? Because they all have fiancés and boyfriends and getting married and all these kind of things that are spoken about in this sort of office of women. She feels compelled, I think, pressured by the keeping up appearances-esque attitude that's still inherent within her to finally say something of herself. And so what does she do? She says that Bradshaw is her lover. She obviously doesn't mention that he's an imaginary horse, but she makes it out that, she is dating, and she has a lover. This is from 49 to 50. I cycled to Ely, if you want to know, she said, with Bradshaw. She had meant to say paintbox. She was a little astonished by her slip of the tongue. Bradshaw? Who's he? Asked Gladys, probably having in mind a games mistress called by her surname. Bradshaw, Miss Peach, said Miss Finlay, in a voice that was as clear as a church bell, has been my lover ever since I was 8. This was an exaggeration, of course. She knew that very well. But she was utterly sick of these nattering peahens and their idiocies. If she was going to give them something to talk about, it might just as well be something worthwhile. And the consternation of their 3 vacuous faces was very enjoyable. Very enjoyable indeed. Mrs. Fleisch's astonishment had brought her letter sorting to a complete stop. With her mouth open and her eyebrows raised, she had the look of a secretary bird, startled by a flying fish. Gladys and Norma were positively goggling, and even Mr. Bacon, with his hangover, had turned from saffron to curry. Rats to their refugee jewellery manufacturers, weddings in white, and American airmen. Just for once she'd shown them a thing or two herself. What's Bradshaw's second name? Asked Norma, shrill with incredulity. Bradshaw, Miss Finlay answered promptly. His first name is Pony. It's short for Poniqua Peter Aylstone Bradshaw. Quite a collection of names, isn't it? That settled Norma. It was as plain on her face as a neon sign. No one could ever think up a name like What? Fancy old rabbit face having a boyfriend all this time and keeping him all to herself, too. She didn't expect they did much together except cycle. Still, it was a bit of a shock all the same. Gladys Peach, however, was far from convinced. Miss Finlay, did you say he was your lover? Why, yes, Miss Peach. We've been sweethearts ever since I had the measles. As a matter of fact, they got rather worried and separated us by sending me to boarding school. Poor old Bradshaw had to go abroad all by himself. To India, as a matter of fact. But he's home again now. Thank heavens. And she goes on and on, creating this alternate life, because condensing Bradshaw, her imagination of Bradshaw, into an anthropomorphized human being that she is dating. And so she begins basically to live a second false life by way of pretending and then having to upkeep the illusion and, in her sense, the delusion that she is living with, at least engaged to and having a social life with someone called Bradshaw. So she's now, in that sense of the transitional object, it's now no longer kind of a temporary vessel meant to keep someone safe. It's now sort of grown out of its bounds, and we see the imagined projection of the fearful, insecure mind of the child that just hasn't matured enough out of that to be able to really find themselves in the world, becomes a literal or somewhat literal partner and companion that is then kept up as a pretense. Of course, as per that original review, the collision, we just immediately suspect, well, this can't be kept up. Of course, there's going to be points where people are going to want to meet Bradshaw or whatever it might be. But this all really, the collision really begins where Mr. Bacon, who was mentioned there very briefly, Herbert Bacon, asks Margaret out for a drink with the intentions of sort of courting or dating, as it would be then. And we're introduced to Mr. Bacon, and they do begin going on their dates, and little is said at times about Bradshaw. But it's interesting that, unlike with Bradshaw, where Margaret is usually drawn back to a sense of being a child, of being silly, of having of that place of insecurity, what happens in the real world, where the need of the requirement of vulnerability and openness is required, either we find a very dualistic sense of feeling in Margaret at this point. It's either one where she thinks that Herbert, quite literally at times, is intent on hurting her or even raping her because she's so fearful of that real world, or it's the inverse, where there is almost an overflow of the real. And this is where Marchant's not very frequent but occasional moments of fantastic prose come through, such as this. He gathered up his hoat and her haversack. Just one more look at the view, she begged. They stood in silence, the great and fertile valley falling from their feet. The sun was sinking, the colours deepening, and the Surrey hills were only a purple haze. It was as if they had been together a long time ago on an island of golden sand that glittered in the sunlight. They had started a long voyage together, only to be separated by a dreadful storm. After the storm there had been nothing but thick grey fog, and her voice in loneliness crying for him had echoed back on itself in mockery. Until now, when after much sorrow and travail, they stood side by side on the topmost mountain, surveying the richness of their kingdom. Soon, soon they would embark on the long white ship, which would bear them swiftly to wheresoever they wished, on a voyage, perhaps, which would circumnavigate the entire Demesne. They would visit the palaces and cathedrals, the gardens and parks, the deepest forests and the highest mountains, and they would bring to all their subjects, rich and poor, the joyous message that the land was at last free from the witch queen's curse, and all the bells would be rung day and night for a week. For they had found the precious flower, They had triumphed at last against the whole host of their innumerable enemies. Now, as long as they believed in each other, their enemies were powerless. The moment of victory after so many dangers and tribulations was sweet. Margaret closed her eyes the better to savour it, and the blaze of light from the sinking sun turned the lids from darkness to rich amber. And so, as beautiful, however, as it seems, I mean, it is a beautiful scene, what the fear begins, I think, for the reader, is that does Margaret at all have control or a balanced, true understanding of what her imagination is doing? In which way is she being taken in terms of delusion? Is her appreciation, her sort of overflowing vitality towards Herbert Bacon itself becoming a delusion that is a sort of literal repetition of what she needed before? And this then goes back and forth in a rather violent scene wave between wanting to completely push him away and withdraw into her fantasy world with Bradshaw, who keeps her safe, but keeps her safe within the bounds of that world that she knew, or this sort of position of vulnerability with the real world, where she doesn't necessarily have control and doesn't know what to do with it. It is the collision of fantasy and reality and fantasy and reality, but is ultimately the collision of security and insecurity. And actually, when she is at her most insecure, she is her securest because she has Bradshaw, and so she's insecure in that old world of she seems to be insecure in that old world of rules and regulations and the trembling child, but she's actually secure in that role because it's all she knows, and she has Bradshaw as that pressure valve of company. And equally, you'd believe she is so secure in reality as it's real, but actually this is where she's most insecure because she has no ability to predict or to imagine up what might happen. She is at the whims of other people's agencies. Now, what's interesting, however, is as this progresses and she realizes that she does desire to, be with Herbert Bacon and pursue this real life, is that, well, and this is a combining. So this is from much nearer the end. And one second, sorry, prior to this, there is a moment where we begin to see after this, after the beginnings of this collision, after the unavoidability of it, the lines of fantasy, the fantastical reality, the imagined reality of Bradshaw begins to subtly, well, not so subtly, falter, as we see in on 158. She went to a film on the way home and didn't get in till nearly 11. Her room was cold. She lit the gas fire and went for a hot bath. But when she returned, the cold was still there. Perhaps it's me, she thought, and putting on the kettle for a hot water bottle, made herself a mug of nice hot milk sweetened with honey. She snuggled up in the armchair very close to the fire and looked at the sketch she had done. The Crusader's wife, utterly cold, utterly still on her tomb. It was a good drawing, too good, in fact. She shuddered slightly and covered it up, for it made her feel funny. She finished her milk, filled with a hot water bottle, jumped quickly into bed and turned out the light. Under the bedclothes she snuggled up to Bradshaw. "Dear heart, I'm cold," she whispered. "Warm me. I feel as if I'm made of stone." Bradshaw's warmth, his soft hairiness against her, turned her from cold marble to flesh and blood. Margaret Finlay was alive again, Princess M, the daughter of a soldier and a soldier herself, advancing into battle on her splendid charger, gold armor flashing in the sun. Behind her was the battle line of knights, all dependent on Princess M's courage and beauty for their success in battle. For she was their inspiration. She unfurled her father's banner, a blood-red lion on a white background, and held up aloft on her glittering lance. "Advance," she cried, and spurred her gallant steed to a canter. She could hear the drumming hoof-beats of the warlike knights at her back. She saw the lines of the enemy drawn up before her, the sunlight on their armor, the richly colored plumes waving in the breeze. Her charger was galloping now full tilt, his hooves pounding the turf. The royal banner flapped in the breeze, her golden hair streamed out behind her. The great horse rose and fell under her. "Charge," she cried, "charge!" The flying horse suddenly shuddered and crumpled to his knees, an enemy arrow quivering in his throat. A great stream of blood gushed forth from it, life-blood, the blood of her most gallant companion of the bosom. Bradshaw, the enemy, had killed him. Now, he doesn't actually die, it's an imagination. But as we see, in her having to deal with this collision, her imagination begins to take her where it has to take her, which is the death of Bradshaw. But what this actually results in is, as I said, the combining of them, the combining of the real, which is Herbert Bacon, and Bradshaw. Eventually, she finds herself saying things like this. Why? Because she allowed herself to get hysterical at the smell of a human being. Human beings, like animals, had their particular odor, so she scorned contact with them. Bradshaw smelled of talcum powder only because he was not real. The reality of Bradshaw was Herbert Bacon, and he had a real smell and real needs. Like a child, he needed her, for who would take care of such a battered little man if she didn't? To use the imagination to escape the responsibility of Bradshaw alive and kicking and eating and drinking and, yes, sweating to a dream Bradshaw. A Bradshaw who never spoke till he was asked, who always disappears when he was a nuisance, who had no needs other than her own, was despicable. The only right use of imagination was to try and make the live Bradshaw happier, and not only him, but all creatures, no matter in how small a way. To despise and fear men and women and animals too, for that matter, was to despise and fear God. To live alone, voluntarily substituting a childhood vision for the love of real persons, was truly to live in sin. The only goodness lay in the giving of herself as best she could to other people, like Poodlehead hanging on to a man's lapel as if he were Clark Gable, and perhaps making him feel as if he were for all his long nose and brown teeth, like Strawberry Nose talking to her for the sake of a little human companionship, because it was a nasty day and a little friendly conversation might brighten up the morning a little. So we are left, I think, my reading here is we're left actually with some unreliability, and Margaret's imagination and inability to truly phase out of childhood leads her with the only way to, it's almost like force an entry into the real world, is to project Bradshaw as an entity onto Herbert Bacon and almost then sculpt him to her requests of what the world should give her. And I don't think anyone's to blame here. What we follow through the whole novel is a trace of sadness that something real was lost, not irretrievably lost, but lost at the beginning via this suffocating atmosphere of the children should be seen and not heard. And in a sort of panic, all Margaret has is the ability to throw out those safe projections of childhood, those safe transitional objects, onto the real world to try some way understand them for herself. And it is in that sense a straightforward novel. There is a journey here. There is a a movement from one phase, if you like, to the other, from childhood possibly to adulthood, or the whole thing is just a move to the ability to begin the transition into adulthood. But there is a maturation, but it's a fairly non-linear maturation where we often will go back to childhood for a little bit and then adulthood again, and then maybe another scene from the past. And so what we then witness with that is the evolution of the imagination. But in seeing the evolution of the imagination, we're suspicious when someone such as Bradshaw arrives again, when Margaret is having a bad day, when she's now 31 out and about with Herbert. And it's Marchant's ability to weave in these moments of suspicious imaginative insertion and to have us have to deal with whether or not, one, it actually has any purchase on reality, or two, it's really beneficial or healthy, and what the place is of that childish, subtly Blakean, I think, attitude toward the world and what to do with it. But there you go. That's my thoughts on Give Me Your Answer Do by Peter Marchant. Head over to Tough Poets Press website. They are they're releasing some really great stuff over there. All of which will, every time I see a new release over there, I'm just, even if rarely do I know the author, but I'm intrigued. The content of which is always unique. So head over and give them the support, because they're a great small press. And no, I wasn't paid to say this. And give me your answer. Do a look. I believe if you're in the UK, it's actually now on offer on Amazon. But yeah, it's my thoughts of Give Me Your Answer Do by Peter Marchant. And it's a very warm novel, and it deserves more praise. It deserves more eyes on it. So there you go. Thanks for listening.